It begins with a guitar riff, a primal, urgent, utterly unforgettable wail that erupts from the speakers like a cry of pure anguish and desire. It's a sound that is instantly recognizable, a 7-minute epic that defines rock and roll passion, pain, and yearning. That song is none other than Layla. But Layla is more than just a song. It's a desperate, searing confession. It's the sound of a heartbreaking, an open wound set to music. And behind its legendary, scorching guitar solos and that haunting piano finale lies one of the most explosive, tragic, and utterly captivating love triangles in rock history. This is the story of Eric Clapton's all-consuming, unrequited, and ultimately destructive obsession with Pattie Boyd, the beautiful model and muse who was, at the time, married to his best friend and fellow rock icon, George Harrison of the Beatles. It's a tale woven through the glittering, yet often dark tapestry of 1960s and 70s rock royalty. A story of intense friendships, profound betrayals, spiritual quests, and the raw, unbridled power of artistic creation born from unimaginable pain. We'll explore how Eric Clapton, a man revered as God on guitar, was brought to his knees by a love he couldn't have, how he channeled that agony into a masterpiece inspired by an ancient Persian poem of impossible love, and how, in a twist of fate, the electrifying arrival of another guitar legend, Duane Allman, in the recording studio, not only shaped Layla's legendary, searing guitar riff, but pushed it from a great song into an immortal anthem of desperate yearning. This is a story of rock and roll, obsession, and the kind of purifying act that can only be found when a human heart is laid bare, amplified, and sent out into the world. This is the secret history of Layla, a riff born of forbidden love. To understand the intensity of the Layla saga, we must first set the stage in the mid-1960s. This was the vibrant, revolutionary era of the British invasion, a time when 4 lads from Liverpool known as the Beatles had conquered the world. And in their wake came a wave of blues rock guitarists, none more celebrated than Eric Clapton. By 1965, George Harrison was riding the unprecedented wave of Beatlemania. The Beatles were at their absolute peak, releasing groundbreaking albums and redefining popular music. George, often seen as the quiet Beatle, was beginning to emerge as a formidable songwriter in his own right, though still overshadowed by the Lennon-McCartney powerhouse. He was also a newly married man, having wed the stunning fashion model Pattie Boyd in January 1966. Pattie Boyd was more than just a beautiful face. She was a quintessential it girl of the swinging 60s, with her striking blonde hair and doe eyes. She had initially met George on the set of the Beatles' film A Hard Day's Night in 1964. She wasn't just George's wife. She became a muse for an entire era. George would write one of his most beloved songs, Something, often considered one of the Beatles' greatest love songs, about her. She inspired countless others. She was, to many, the epitome of the idealized, ethereal beauty of the late 60s. Meanwhile, Eric Clapton was forging his own legendary path, known as Slow Hand for his technical brilliance and soulful playing. Clapton was quickly establishing himself as the premier blues rock guitarist in Britain, if not the world. After electrifying stints with the Yardbirds and John Mayall and the Bluesbreakers, he co-founded Cream in 1966, forming one of rock's first true supergroups. Cream pushed the boundaries of blues rock, with long, improvisational jams and a raw, powerful sound. Fans famously spray-painted Clapton is God on walls across London, reflecting his almost mythical status. Despite their different bands and styles, a deep friendship began to form between Eric Clapton and George Harrison. This was a common occurrence in the close-knit London music scene. They were both young, incredibly talented, and navigating the strange, exhilarating world of rock stardom. They shared a profound love for the blues, a passion that often found them jamming together late into the night. George, still developing his guitar style within the Beatles, was greatly influenced by Eric's virtuosity. He saw Clapton as a master, often asking him for tips and techniques. Their friendship deepened into a genuine bond. They visited each other's homes, shared meals, and spent hours talking about music, life, and the spiritual quests that were beginning to interest George particularly. They were more than just colleagues. They were brothers in arms in the rock and roll revolution. It was through this friendship that Eric Clapton first met Pattie Boyd. She was, of course, George's wife, a familiar presence at their shared gatherings. Clapton initially viewed her as a friend, part of George's world. But slowly, subtly, something began to shift for Clapton. He was drawn to her beauty, of course, but also to her gentle nature, her warmth, her quiet intelligence. He began to see something more than just George's wife. He began to see the woman who would become his obsession. The seeds of the love triangle were sown in the late 1960s. By 1968, the Beatles were at a crossroads. Tensions were mounting within the band, and George was often feeling stifled, his songwriting contributions struggling for recognition against the dominant Lennon-McCartney partnership. It was during this period that George invited Eric Clapton to play the iconic guitar solo on his song "While My Guitar Gently Weeps" from the White Album. This was an extraordinary gesture, unprecedented for the Beatles to bring in an outside musician for such a prominent role. It was a testament to George's respect for Eric's talent and the depth of their friendship. That soaring, emotional solo by Clapton remains one of the most celebrated moments in the Beatles' discography. However, the close proximity, the shared creative space, only intensified Clapton's growing feelings for Pattie. He was spending more and more time at Friar Park, George and Pattie's sprawling Gothic mansion in Henley-on-Thames. He was a frequent guest, a trusted friend, and in this intimate setting, as George became more and more absorbed in his spiritual pursuits, he was deeply involved with transcendental, meditation, and Eastern mysticism. A quiet, unspoken connection began to develop between Eric and Pattie. Clapton, a man often consumed by his passions, found himself falling desperately, hopelessly in love with his best friend's wife. It was a forbidden love, a dangerous desire that flew in the face of all loyalty and friendship. And this impossible situation, this agonizing yearning, would soon erupt into one of the most powerful songs in rock history. The stage was set for a masterpiece born of heartache and betrayal. The late 1960s were a time of intense contradiction, especially for the rock and roll elite. The Summer of Love in 1967, with its message of peace and free love, had given way to a more complex, darker reality. By 1969, the year of Altamont and the Manson murders, the utopian dream was fracturing. For those at the very top, like the Beatles and their inner circle, life was a whirlwind of immense wealth, spiritual searching, and profound personal pressures. George Harrison's marriage to Pattie Boyd was not immune to these pressures. From the outside, their life at Friar Park looked like a fairy tale. It was a magnificent estate with sprawling gardens, a place where George could indulge his growing passion for horticulture and escape the madness of being a Beatle. But inside, things were complicated. George was on a deep and genuine spiritual journey, diving headfirst into Indian music, culture, and Hindu philosophy. This quest, which had begun years earlier, was becoming the central focus of his life, often leading to long periods of meditation, chanting, and detachment from the world around him. Pattie, while supportive, often felt left behind. She was young, vibrant, and at the center of the fashion and music world. But her husband was increasingly on a different, more ascetic path. At the same time, the pressures of Beatlemania were immense, and infidelity was a common, almost casual part of the rock and roll lifestyle. George, for all his spirituality, was not immune to the temptations of his station. The perfect marriage began to show deep, quiet cracks. Pattie later described feeling isolated and neglected, a beautiful object in a magnificent but lonely house. Into this complex emotional landscape stepped Eric Clapton. He wasn't just a visitor, he was a confidant, one of the few people who could understand the surreal pressures of their lives. He saw a woman he idealized, who seemed to him to be underappreciated, misunderstood, and available on an emotional level that her husband, his best friend, was neglecting. Clapton's own life was in turmoil. His band Cream had spectacularly imploded in 1968, torn apart by ego and exhaustion. His next supergroup, Blind Faith, which featured Steve Winwood, Ginger Baker, and Rick Gretsch, had been a massive commercial success, but an artistic disappointment for Clapton. It was overhyped and burned out in less than a year. He was creatively restless, musically unsatisfied, and grappling with a burgeoning substance dependency that would soon spiral out of control. He was a man celebrated as God by his fans, yet he felt like a fraud. He was surrounded by people, yet felt profoundly lonely. And in Pattie Boyd, he began to see a solution to all his pain, an idealized, almost holy grail of a woman whose love, he believed, could save him. His yearning for her became all-consuming, a desperate, aching obsession that overshadowed everything else in his life. This was not a casual crush. This was a deep, painful, and forbidden fixation. He and Pattie began meeting in secret, not as physical lovers, but as close, clandestine friends. They would talk for hours. He wrote her passionate, desperate letters. He was pouring all of his emotional energy into this impossible pursuit. It was during this period of intense longing, around 1970, that a friend gave Clapton a book. It was a 12th century Persian poem, the story of Layla and Majnun, by the poet Nizami Ganjavi. For Clapton, reading this book was not just a literary experience, it was a devastating moment of self-recognition. The poem tells the tragic story of a young man, Kais, who falls in love with a beautiful girl named Layla. He is so consumed by his love for her that he is driven to madness. He is unable to eat, unable to sleep, and wanders the desert, writing poems about her, shouting her name. He becomes known as Majnun, which in Arabic means possessed or madman. Layla's father, disapproving of this obsessed, wild-eyed suitor, refuses the match and marries her off to another, more suitable man. The story is a classic of Eastern literature, a tale of love so powerful it transcends reason, sanity, and even life itself. When Layla is forced into this arranged marriage, Majnun's obsession only deepens. He rejects the world entirely, living as a hermit in the wilderness, his only companions the animals, his only purpose to sing of his unattainable love for Layla. The story ends in tragedy, with both Layla and Majnun dying of their broken hearts, their love only truly consummated in death. For Eric Clapton, this was not an ancient poem. It was his diary. He was Majnun. He was the madman, driven to distraction by his love for a woman who was married to another, more suitable man, his best friend. And Pattie was his Layla. This ancient text gave his personal, messy, and guilt-ridden obsession a grand, epic, and tragic framework. It elevated his desire from a tawdry affair into a timeless, poetic struggle. It gave him a name for his pain, and it gave him a name for his muse. Layla was no longer just Pattie. She was the unattainable ideal, the subject of the greatest love story ever told. This literary discovery was the final, critical piece of the puzzle. His pain now had a name, his obsession now had a narrative, and he, a musician, had only one way to truly express it. He had to write a song. He had to create something so powerful, so direct, that it would not only convey the depth of his feeling, but perhaps win her over. He wasn't just writing a song. He was forging a weapon, a final, desperate plea. He began to channel all of this raw, agonizing energy into his music. After the collapse of Blind Faith, Clapton had formed a new, more anonymous-sounding band with the American musicians from Delaney and Bonnie and Friends, a group he had toured with. This new band, which he called Derek and the Dominoes, was a deliberate move away from the supergroup spotlight. He wanted to be part of a real, democratic, hard-rocking band, not a god on a pedestal. The lineup included Bobby Whitlock on keyboards and vocals, Carl Radel on bass, and Jim Gordon on drums. In the late summer of 1970, Derek and the Dominoes went to Miami to record their debut album at Criteria Studios. Their producer was the legendary Tom Dowd, a man who had engineered some of the greatest R&B and soul records of all time for Atlantic Records. The band was tight, raw, and fueled by a combustible mix of creative energy and escalating substance use. They were laying down tracks for what would become the double album, Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs. Clapton had the main body of his song written. It was a fast, almost frantic rocker, built on a desperate descending guitar riff. He had the verse, "What'll you do when you get lonely, and nobody's waiting by your side?" It was a direct question to Patty, a plea, a sales pitch. "You've been running and hiding much too long. You know it's just your foolish pride." He was confronting her directly, challenging her to leave her husband. And then, the chorus, where he finally, explicitly, used the name from the poem. "Layla, you've got me on my knees, Layla. I'm begging, darling. Please, Layla, darling. Won't you ease my worried mind?" This was not a subtle metaphor. This was a man on his knees, begging. It was the sound of Majnun, the madman, howling in the desert. The song was good. It was powerful. It was desperate, but it was missing something. It was missing the final spark, the element that would push it from a great song into an immortal one. The band recorded the basic track, but it just wasn't quite there. It lacked a definitive hook, a musical signature as powerful as the emotion behind it. And then, in a moment of pure, unadulterated musical fate, Tom Dowd received a phone call. The Allman Brothers Band, a revolutionary new group from Georgia, were playing a concert in Miami. Dowd, who was also producing their album Idlewild South, invited Clapton to come down to the show. Clapton, who had heard of the band's young, fiery slide guitarist, agreed. What happened next would not only change the song Layla, but would change the course of rock guitar history forever. Eric Clapton walked into the concert hall in Miami, a living legend, the man his fans called God. He was there, at producer Tom Dowd's suggestion, to see a young American band, the Allman Brothers. Clapton, by his own admission, had become somewhat insulated by his own fame. He was familiar with British blues, but this new wave of American Southern rock was something different. He stood in the crowd, unrecognized, and watched the show. And then he heard it. He heard Duane Allman play slide guitar. It was a sound unlike anything he had ever heard. It wasn't just fast, though it was that. It wasn't just technically brilliant. It was vocal. Duane wasn't playing notes. He was making the guitar sing. He was playing with a glass vial on his finger, coaxing out a sound that was at once as sharp as a razor, as mournful as a human voice, and as fluid as water. It was the sound of the deep blues, but electrified, supercharged, and played with a ferocious, soaring intensity. Clapton was, in his own words, knocked out. This 23-year-old from Florida, with his long red hair and intense focus, was playing on a level that Clapton hadn't seen in anyone. The man called God was witnessing a revelation. After the show, a starstruck Duane Allman was told that Eric Clapton was in the audience and wanted to meet him. The Allman Brothers, who revered Clapton, were brought back to Criteria Studios. What followed was one of the most legendary, spontaneous jam sessions in rock and roll history. The two guitarists, the British blues rock king and the American slide guitar prodigy, didn't just shake hands, they plugged in. For hours, until the sun came up, they played. The rest of both bands, producers, and engineers watched in stunned silence. This was not a competition. It was a conversation, a joyous, high-level musical dialogue. They traded licks. They pushed each other. They found an instant, almost telepathic chemistry. They were, as Clapton would later say, instant partners. They had found in each other a long-lost brother. In that one all-night session, a deep musical and personal bond was forged. By morning, it was clear that this meeting was more than just a jam. It was fate. Clapton, electrified by this new energy, asked Duane a simple question. "Will you play on my record?" Duane, of course, agreed. This is the event that changed everything. Layla was, at this point, a good, frantic song. It was a plea, but it was still just a rock track. Eric Clapton, now joined by his new musical soulmate, played him the song. The story goes that Clapton showed him the main verse riff, his desperate, fast-paced rocker. Duane listened, and then he pulled a slide from his pocket. He had an idea. He suggested slowing the song down just a touch, giving it more of a swampy, bluesy feel. Then, borrowing from an old Albert King blues song, "As the Years Go Passing By," Dwayne started to play a counter melody on his slide. It was a high, wailing, mournful sound that perfectly mirrored the human voice, that perfectly captured the begging in Clapton's lyrics. And then, the riff, the iconic seven-note opening that is the song. This was not Clapton's riff. This was Duane Allman's. He played that searing, descending and ascending lick, and the room fell silent. It was the sound of Majnun, the madman, howling in the desert. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated anguish. It was the perfect musical translation of the song's entire theme. Clapton was floored. This was the missing ingredient. This was the hook. The two of them, in a burst of creative fire, began to build the song around this new riff. What had been a straightforward song was now becoming a complex, layered tapestry. They began to weave their guitars together, not as a lead and a rhythm, but as two distinct voices, two souls in conversation. The recording of the main body of Layla was an act of pure inspiration. It was a 6-guitar track plus piano and drums and bass and vocal behemoth, all recorded on 16-track tape. Clapton and Allman stood side by side in the studio, trading licks. Clapton played the main, jagged riff, his Fender Stratocaster providing the sharp, rhythmic attack. Duane Allman played the soaring, wailing slide part, his Gibson Les Paul providing the song's emotional cry. If you listen closely, you can hear the interplay. It's a frantic, beautiful duel. Clapton's guitar is the sound of desperate, clawing desire. Allman's slide is the sound of pure, heartbroken pain. Together, they created a texture of such emotional density that it was almost overwhelming. Clapton's pained, raw vocal, "I'm begging, darling, please," was no longer a standalone plea. It was now supported by an army of guitars, all screaming the same thing. The song was now a monster, a true masterpiece of rock and roll anguish, but it was still incomplete. It had a beginning and a middle, but it had no end. It just stopped, fading out on the frantic, unresolved riff. It was powerful, but it was just one act of the play. The song's second, and perhaps most haunting movement, was born from another act of pure chance, and from another member of the band. Jim Gordon, the band's drummer, was also a skilled piano player. Days after the main Layla track was recorded, Tom Dowd, the producer, was walking past a piano room at Criteria. He heard Gordon playing a beautiful, mournful, and incredibly sad piano melody. Dowd was stopped in his tracks. "What is that?" he asked. Gordon explained it was just a little piece he'd written, something he was planning to use on his own. Dowd knew immediately what he was hearing. This was the end of the song. This was the resolution. This was the come-down, the morning after to the song's desperate, feverish night. He brought the idea to Eric Clapton. This was another radical suggestion. Taking this entirely separate, beautiful, classical-sounding piano piece and literally grafting it onto the end of their ferocious rock and roll epic was unheard of. It defied all rules of pop songwriting. A 3-minute rock anthem followed by a 4-minute instrumental piano coda. It was commercial suicide. But Clapton, in his Layla-obsessed state, heard the genius in it. This 2-part structure perfectly mirrored the story of Layla and Majnun. The first half, the fast, frantic, guitar-driven part, was Majnun's madness, his desperate, screaming plea in the desert. The second half, this slow, mournful, almost funereal piano piece, was the tragic aftermath. It was the sound of unresolved longing, of the story ending in sorrow, not in victory. It was the sound of the lovers' graves. So, they recorded it. Jim Gordon played his beautiful piano part. Tom Dowd and Clapton meticulously layered it. And then, in a final act of genius, they brought in Duane Allman one last time. Over the top of Gordon's melancholy piano, Duane laid down a final, soaring, acoustic slide guitar solo. It is one of the most beautiful guitar parts ever recorded. It is the sound of a soul ascending, a final, wordless expression of grief and beauty. As the song fades out on that piano and that weeping guitar, the listener is left not with the fire of the main riff, but with a profound, almost holy sense of sadness. The song was complete. It was a 7-minute, 2-part symphony of obsession. It had been born from a dream, fueled by a forbidden love, inspired by a 12th century poem, ignited by a chance meeting of two guitar gods, and completed by an accidental piano piece. It was an impossible, miraculous creation. And now, Eric Clapton had to wait and see if the woman he wrote it for, his Layla, had truly heard his plea. In November 1970, the double album Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs by Derek and the Dominoes was released. It was housed in a simple, almost drab cover, a painting of a blonde woman who was not Pattie Boyd, titled La Fille au Bouquet. Eric Clapton's name was not on the front. He was intentionally hiding inside the band, rejecting his god status. The album was a sprawling, bluesy, emotionally raw masterpiece, filled with songs of devotion, pain, and longing, all aimed at one person. And at its center was the 7-minute title track. This was it. This was Clapton's grand gesture, his poem from the desert, his ultimate plea. The album was, in his own words, a declaration of love. He had poured his entire being into this song, this monument of obsession. The album was released, and the world responded with a deafening silence. It was a complete commercial failure. It failed to chart in the United Kingdom. In the US, it peaked at a dismal number 16. The public, looking for the next Cream or Blind Faith album, didn't know what Derek and the Dominoes was. The title track, Layla, was too long, too complex, too emotionally frantic for 1970s pop radio, which was moving toward the softer sounds of singer-songwriters. But the commercial failure was secondary to the personal one. The true audience for the song was an audience of one. The story of its debut to Pattie Boyd is now the stuff of legend. Some accounts say he played her the master tape at a small, intimate party. Others, more dramatically, say he cornered her alone. He put the needle on the record, turned up the volume, and watched her face as his voice and Duane Allman's wailing guitar filled the room. Imagine that moment. Pattie Boyd, trapped in a failing marriage, stands listening as her husband's best friend plays her a song that is not a subtle hint, but a full-blown 7-minute confession of his agonizing love for her. A song that uses a secret, mythical name for her, Layla. A song that begs her, "Darling, won't you ease my worried mind?" Pattie was, by her own account, mesmerized. She was flattered, but she was also terrified. It was the most passionate, desperate, and beautiful thing anyone had ever done for her. But it was also a horrifying ultimatum. He was forcing her to choose. This wasn't a poem. It was a confrontation. And in that moment, Pattie Boyd made her choice. She was overwhelmed, but she was still married. She was still George Harrison's wife. She turned Eric Clapton down. She chose to stay with her husband. For Clapton, this was the end of the line. His grand gesture, his masterpiece, the song he had poured his entire soul into, had failed on every conceivable level. It had failed commercially, disappearing from the charts without a trace. And it had failed romantically, rejected by the very woman who had inspired it. The madman, Majnun, had howled his song into the desert, and Layla had turned away. This rejection was the final, devastating blow. It was the catalyst that pushed Clapton from a man struggling with substances into a full-blown, reclusive addict. The pain of this double failure was too much to bear. The band itself, Derek and the Dominoes, disintegrated almost immediately. Their combustible creative energy, fueled by immense talent and an ocean of hard substances, simply burned out. Tragedy struck when Duane Allman, Clapton's long-lost brother and the song's co-architect, was killed in a motorcycle accident in October 1971, less than a year after the album's release. This sealed the band's fate. For Clapton, the light had gone out. He retreated. He went back to his mansion, Hurtwood Edge, and pulled up the drawbridge. For the next 3 years, Eric Clapton, the man they called God, essentially disappeared. He succumbed to a crippling heroin addiction, living in a dark, shuttered world, rarely seeing anyone, rarely touching a guitar. His masterpiece, Layla, had not saved him. It had, in its failure, nearly destroyed him. During these dark years, the song lay dormant. It was a cult classic, a deep cut, known by musicians and serious fans. But it was not the anthem we know today. It was a failure, a painful memory, the sound of Clapton's rock bottom. And then, in 1972, the song's second life began. Producer Tom Dowd, who had never lost faith in the music, was compiling a retrospective of Clapton's career called The History of Eric Clapton. He pulled Layla from the failed album, but a 7-minute epic was still a hard sell for radio, so an edited version was created, chopping the song down to just 2 minutes and 43 seconds, focusing almost entirely on the opening guitar riff and the frantic, begging chorus. This shortened, more radio-friendly version of Layla was released as a single, and this time, 2 years after its initial death, the world was finally ready. The song exploded. It became a top 10 hit in both the United States and the United Kingdom. It was a stunning, delayed resurrection. This success was a lifeline for Clapton. It was the first sign of a world that still wanted him. It helped, in part, to give him the strength to begin his long, difficult journey out of addiction. By 1974, Eric Clapton had re-emerged. He was clean, and he had a new album, 461 Ocean Boulevard. It was a new sound, more relaxed, laid back, almost sunny, and, in the final, dramatic twist of the story, he was now with Pattie Boyd. After her own marriage to George Harrison had finally, amicably dissolved, she had chosen to be with Eric. The man who had been Majnun, the madman, had finally, after all the pain, won his Layla. This new reality changed the song forever. Layla was no longer a desperate, howling plea of unrequited love. It was a memory. It was a trophy. It was the sound of a battle that had been won. When Clapton began to play Layla in concert again, it was different. The desperate, frantic edge was gone. It became more of a classic rock anthem, a celebration of a riff that everyone now knew. The meaning of the song had transformed for him, from a raw, open wound to a healed, if still visible, scar. This transformation would find its ultimate expression almost 20 years later in 1992 Unplugged performance, where he would reinvent the song completely, turning the rock and roll howl into a slow, gentle, acoustic blues. That version, too, would become a massive global hit, proving the song's incredible durability and its ability to adapt to its creator's changing life. It was a song that grew up with him. The 1972 re-release of Layla was a commercial triumph, but it was also a historical correction. The public, now fully aware of Eric Clapton's solo journey, was ready to listen. The shortened 2-minute and 43-second version was a perfect radio-friendly missile, a concentrated blast of the song's raw, guitar-driven angst. It was the sound of 1970s album-oriented rock, and it was undeniable. It climbed the charts, pulling the Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs album back from the dead with it. The double album, once a cutout bin failure, was re-examined and began its slow ascent to its rightful place as one of the greatest rock and roll records ever made. This first resurrection cemented the song's place in the rock canon. It was now a staple, a classic, but it was still the sound of a very specific time, a fiery, desperate, drug-fueled plea from a young man at his breaking point. The song, for the next 20 years, belonged to 1970. It was a perfect, screaming artifact of its era, preserved in amber. Then, in 1992, Layla was born again, and this transformation was perhaps even more profound than its first. Eric Clapton, now in his late 40s, was a different man. He was a survivor. He had endured the depths of addiction and come out the other side. He had also suffered an unimaginable personal tragedy, the death of his young son, Connor, in 1991. He was an artist marked by decades of profound pain and hard-won sobriety. He agreed to perform on MTV Unplugged, a popular show where rock artists stripped down their biggest hits, playing them acoustically. For his set, Clapton decided to revisit his old catalog, but not as a greatest hits victory lap. He wanted to re-excavate the songs, to find new meaning in them. He took the fiery, electric howl of Layla and completely deconstructed it. The version he performed on Unplugged was a shock. The iconic, frantic riff was gone. The screaming, layered guitars were gone. The desperate, pleading vocal was gone. In their place was a slow, shuffling, acoustic blues. The melody was the same, but the feel was transformed. It was no longer a desperate plea. It was a weary, world-worn reflection. It was the sound of a man looking back, with a lifetime of distance, at the all-consuming passion of his youth. The song was no longer, "I'm begging you, I'm going insane." It was, "I remember when I was insane, and here's what it sounded like." This new, slowed-down arrangement gave the lyrics a completely different power. They sounded less like a demand and more like a sad, bluesy poem. The famous piano coda, the Layla and Majnun funeral march, was now integrated into the song's main body. Its melody played gently on the acoustic guitar, a final, melancholy grace note. The public reaction was arguably even more massive than the song's first resurrection. The Unplugged album became the best-selling album of Clapton's entire career, selling tens of millions of copies worldwide. The new Layla won the Grammy Award for Best Rock Song. It was everywhere. A new generation, Generation X, who had missed the original release, adopted this new, mournful Layla as their own. It became a staple in coffee shops, on college campuses, and on adult contemporary radio. The song had, impossibly, become a hit twice, in two completely different forms, for two completely different generations. This second avalanche of success cemented Layla as more than just a classic song. It was now an immortal piece of music, a text that could be reinterpreted, a melody so strong it could withstand any arrangement and still retain its emotional core. It was a story that could be retold. The fiery howl of 1970 was the sound of the obsession. The acoustic lament of 1992 was the sound of the scar. The song's cultural verdict is absolute. Layla is, without question, one of the greatest rock songs ever recorded. The twin guitar masterpiece by Eric Clapton and Duane Allman is consistently ranked at the top of greatest guitar song lists. It is the definitive anthem of romantic yearning, the go-to song for any story of impossible, all-consuming love. It has transcended its origins to become a universal expression of passion. But the personal verdict, the story of the three people at the heart of this triangle, is far more complex, more human, and ultimately more fascinating than the myth. Did Eric Clapton, the madman Majnun, finally win his Layla? Yes, he got what he wanted. After Pattie Boyd's marriage to George Harrison dissolved in 1974, due to a combination of George's continued spiritual detachment and his own infidelities, she and Eric finally came together. They moved into Hurtwood Edge, and in 1979, they were married. But the story does not end there. This was not a happily ever after ending. The fantasy, as it so often is, was not the reality. The song was a perfect, idealized 7-minute explosion of longing. Real life was a complicated, day-to-day affair. The Layla that Clapton had won was a real person, not the poetic ideal of his obsession. And Eric Clapton, though he had beaten his heroin addiction, was soon in the grips of a severe battle with alcoholism. Their relationship, born from such intense passion, was fraught with the same demons that had haunted Clapton for years. The man who had begged, "Darling, won't you ease my worried mind?" found that possessing the object of his desire did not, in fact, ease his mind. His worried mind was his own. The beast he had to kill was not George Harrison. It was the one inside himself. Pattie and Eric's marriage was difficult, marked by his struggles and infidelities, and it ultimately ended in divorce in 1989. The grand, operatic passion of the song could not sustain the quiet, everyday demands of a marriage. The reality was, as it always is, far messier than the art. And what of the baffled king, the betrayed best friend, George Harrison? This, perhaps, is the most surprising and moving part of the entire story. In a world of rock and roll egos, feuds, and rivalries, George Harrison's reaction was one of almost Zen-like acceptance. Yes, he was deeply hurt. The betrayal was real. But George, whose spiritual journey was genuine, seemed to understand the human heart in a way few others did. He saw his best friend, a man he loved, in the grips of an agonizing obsession. He saw his own marriage, which had been struggling for years, finally coming to its natural end, and he let it go. There was no grand confrontation, no street fightin' man. Instead, George Harrison remained friends with Eric Clapton. In fact, he not only attended Eric and Patty's wedding, he played at it. He joined Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr on stage for a semi-reunions of the Beatles, playing for the woman who had left him and the best friend who had stolen her. George's famous quote on the matter perfectly summarized his philosophical, almost comically detached view of the whole affair. He reportedly said of Clapton, "He's got the wife, but I've still got the band's publishing." More poignantly, he simply referred to Eric as his husband-in-law. He refused to be the victim. He refused to let this one act of betrayal destroy a deep and important friendship. He understood, perhaps, that Patty was not a possession to be owned, but a person on her own journey. This, then, is the final verdict on Layla. The song is not a celebration of victory. It is a monument to obsession. It's the sound of a man so consumed by a feeling that he builds a 7-minute cathedral to it. It is a song about wanting something so badly you are willing to burn down your own life and your best friends to get it. It is, in its own way, a deeply selfish song, and that is precisely what gives it its terrifying, relatable power. The love triangle that created it did not resolve in a clean, storybook way. It resolved in a messy, human, and surprisingly gentle way. The king wasn't baffled forever. He found his own peace. The madman got his Layla, only to find that she was a real person, not a poetic cure for his own inner demons. And the song outgrew them all. Layla no longer belongs to Eric, or to George, or to Patty. It belongs to anyone who has ever felt that irrational, all-consuming fire. It is the sound of wanting. It is the sound of needing. It is the sound of a man on his knees, begging. And in its perfect, painful, searing honesty, it became an anthem for the entire world. The stories behind the music we love are often more complex, more tragic, and more human than we could ever imagine. If you want to keep exploring these secret histories, be sure to subscribe to our channel. There are so many more songs to unpack.